It's the late 20th century, and the hippie era is coming to an end. A young 15-year-old girl and 3 associates stand at the side of the road, with their arms extended and thumbs up. They're looking to hike a ride, although frowned upon nowadays. Hitchhiking was a common practice in the hippie era. Hitchhiking was a practice that involved jumping into a stranger's car and getting a free ride to a pre-agreed destination. After waiting a while, finally a man in his mid-40s pulls up. He offers the girl a lift. However, he says he can't take her companions, despite driving a large van. The young teen was desperate and naive. So, against the advice of her comrades, she makes the decision to get in the vehicle alone. She was on edge at first, but after the man introduced himself, he reminded her of her grandfather, so she quickly felt at ease. So at ease that she decided to take a nap. When she woke up, she immediately noticed that they were traveling in the wrong direction. She queries the man, and he informs her that he'd taken a wrong turn, and promptly does a U-turn. The young teen knows better. She's on edge, but also in the middle of nowhere, so sits tight, not making any rash decisions. The driver turns down a side country lane. Trees line the road on either side for as far as the eyes can see. They are blocking out the skies above. The man pulls over, tells the young teen that he needs to relieve himself. He said he'd be right back. The teen girl senses something isn't right. She begins plotting her escape plan in her head as soon as he left the car. She opens her door, bends down and begins to tie her laces just in case she needs to run. She hears a loud thud. Everything goes black. The next time the teen opens her eyes, she has a throbbing headache, and is tied up in the back of the van. She is then repeatedly assaulted, for hours on end, until sunrise. This man was the devil incarnate, and not being satisfied with the level of suffering he had subjected her to. Her attacker proceeds to decapitate not one, but both her hands with a hatchet. She screams in agony until she passes out. Once the attacker was convinced she had bled out, he drives her lifeless body to a quiet road. Tosses her blood-soaked body into a ditch, stuffs her into a culvert, and drives off, believing he had got away with his malevolent crime. One thing he didn't count on was this brave girl's will to survive. With a surge of adrenaline, her eyes flick open, she jumps up, wriggles free, and decides she is not going to die today. Nothing short of a miracle. This is the incredible, true survival story of a brave young girl's willingness to live. The infamous case of a crime so hideous, it would go on to change the laws of the land forever. Please note, today's video is a very sensitive topic. The following video contains graphic descriptions of true events that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewers' discretion is advised. September 29, 1978, a 15-year-old girl by the name of Vincent stands by the side of the road with 2 comrades. They are attempting to hike a ride, and had been standing by the side of the road, with their arms extended for a little while, before a man in a blue van pulls over. Mary, a 15-year-old teen, would walk over to the man and lean into the passenger side of the vehicle. She informs the man that her and her 2 friends are looking for a lift, and asks if he would be willing to take them. Despite driving a big blue van, the man informs Mary he can only take her, and her alone. Mary glares at him with a puzzled expression, as she can clearly see there was more than enough space for her and her 2 friends. She informs the man they are a nice group and are all going in the same direction, and pleads with him to take all 3 of them. He then looks at Mary and says, "Listen here, I can only take you, either take it or leave it." Mary was apprehensive, but being young and naive, she asks the man to hold on, and runs back over to her friends to explain the situation. Her 2 travel companions advised her not to get in the car with this man. Something just didn't seem right. He clearly had more than enough space for all of them in his van. Hell, if he wanted to, he could have taken 6 people comfortably. Although Mary's gut was telling her they were right, against her better judgment, she opted to ignore her friends and leave with the man anyway. A decision that would not only change her life forever, but also change the very laws that govern the entire state. Mary was somewhat of a troubled child, who lived by her own rules. Vincent grew up in Las Vegas, but she ran away from home at the age of 15. She moved to California with her older boyfriend, where the 2 lived out of a car. However, this relationship didn't last long, as shortly after moving to California to live with him, He would soon go on to be arrested for assaulting another teenage girl, leaving Mary stranded in another state fending for herself. September the 29th, 1978, the day she jumped into the stranger's car, not wanting to go back home. She was attempting to get a ride to Corona, another part of California where her grandfather resided, roughly 400 miles away from her current location. This is when she was picked up by the man in a blue van, although she was nervous at first, due to the strange circumstances with him not wanting to take her friends. They would soon get acquainted. A softly spoken middle-aged man, who looked harmless enough, introduced himself as Lawrence. He was a 50-year-old man who very much reminded her of her grandfather. While on the journey, Mary sneezed. Lawrence would soon place his hand on her chest area to check her temperature. This put Mary on edge. However, she gave him the benefit of the doubt after he explained what he was doing. After the introductions were made, Mary began to feel settled. She told Lawrence she had had a long day and was tired. She asked if it would be okay if she fell asleep as they had a long journey ahead of them. Lawrence told Mary it wouldn't be an issue, so she would go on to lean to the right, rest her head on her shoulder and fall asleep. When she woke up, Mary almost immediately noticed they were traveling in the wrong direction. She sat up to attention, and queried this with Lawrence. He explained, it was a genuine mistake, and he had taken a wrong turn. Mary was young, but not stupid. They were way too far in the wrong direction for this to be an accident. She saw a stick on the floor, and picked it up and put it to her side, just in case she needed to use it. However, Lawrence would soon do a U-turn and start driving in the correct direction. Mary knew she had to get away, but not wanting to alarm Lawrence, she played it cool, clutching her stick and being as vigilant as possible, while trying to put together an escape plan in her head. Lawrence tells Mary he needs to relieve himself and that he's going to look for somewhere to pull over. Mary says okay. At the same time, she noticed her shoelaces were untied. She knew she would need to tie them up in case she needed to run, but wanted to be as inconspicuous as possible while doing so. Mary expected Lawrence to pull over at the side of the road. However, when Lawrence then proceeded to turn down a quiet country lane, in the middle of nowhere, alarm bells began to go off in the young teenager's head. Trees lined the road on either side for as far as the eyes could see, blocking out the skies above. As Lawrence leaves the vehicle, Mary opens her passenger door, bends over, and proceeds to tie her laces in preparation to run. But out of nowhere she hears a loud thud, and everything goes black. Without any warning, Lawrence had struck Mary in the back of her head so hard she was instantly knocked unconscious. When she came to, her hands and feet were bound. She was tied up in the back of the van. She was being assaulted by Lawrence. She would beg and plead for him to stop. However, her cries would fall upon deaf ears. He then told her, if she proceeds to scream, he will execute her. This vile man would continue to assault her for hours on end, throughout the night, until sunrise. Once he had grown tired, he left Mary, climbed back into the front of the vehicle and fell asleep. Mary would attempt to escape her restraints, but her efforts were futile. So, after a while she gave up, and laid there, heart racing as she contemplated her fate. 1,000 scenarios running through her head, none of them good. After several hours of an agonizing wait, Lawrence woke up. He proceeded to drive the vehicle for what seemed like forever, before pulling over and parking at the side of another secluded road in the middle of nowhere. He proceeds to assault Mary again. This time, once he was done, he exited the back of the van. Mary was begging and pleading to be set free. She told him if he lets her go, she won't tell anyone. Lawrence looks at Mary, and says, "You want to be free? Okay, if you don't tell anyone, I'll set you free." He unties her restraints, and stands her upright outside the van. Before Mary can even acknowledge what is taking place, Lawrence reaches into the van, and pulls out a hatchet. He grabs Mary's left arm by the wrist, and with one smooth motion, swoops down, severing her arm at the elbow. Mary stumbles back. She's in disbelief, confused and shocked. She's staring at her arm. She has a firm grip on her attacker, yet she's off balance and falling backwards towards the ground. Lawrence smirks, as if he is proud of what he's done. He cut off Mary's arm with one clean swipe. Looking into his eyes, she no longer sees the kind, soft-spoken man she met earlier on that day, but a soulless monster living amongst men. He proceeds to approach Mary again, who at this point is screaming and fighting with all her might to keep him off her, hitting him with her remaining arm and kicking him in a bid to keep him away. However, he would overpower her. She grabbed his arm, in a bid to prevent him from chopping off her remaining arm. To no avail, he simply swapped hands and began to hack away at her remaining arm. As he was using his weaker arm, it would take Lawrence no less than 4 painful swipes before he would finally chop Mary's other arm off. Mary would let out an ear-bursting cry and collapse to the floor in a pool of her own blood. While she was in this state, Lawrence had noticed her severed hand still had a firm grip on him, so he would struggle to pry it off. Once he finally released himself from her arm's grip, he noticed she had stopped screaming. Her limp body was laying there lifeless, convinced she was deceased. Lawrence would proceed to throw her lifeless body off the side of the road, where he had seen a culvert. As she hit the rocks below, Lawrence would carefully climb down and stuff her lifeless body into the culvert, so it would be out of sight from anyone passing by on the road above. He then made his way back to his car and drove away like nothing had happened. Bruised, battered, defiled, and having lost a massive amount of blood, by all means, this should have been the end of Mary Vincent, but if there ever was an argument for divine intervention, this would be it. Against all odds, Mary had survived. As a matter of fact, in a later interview, Mary would go on to say that she actually planned her survival from the moment he first cut off her first arm. She knew that if she had any chance of survival, she would need to play dead, and that's exactly what she did, and she must have been running on pure adrenaline. Because when both her arms had been chopped off, and her body thrown off the side of the road into the canyon, she would break 4 of her ribs on the rocks below. Even though in excruciating pain, she knew she couldn't make a sound, as if he discovered she was still alive, he would finish her off for sure. Not knowing if Lawrence had left or not, Mary would continue to lay still, in an awkward position, stuffed into the culvert until she began to feel extremely drowsy due to the amount of blood she was losing. She felt herself fading away, and just before she lost consciousness, a voice would go off in her head, telling her not to fall asleep, as if she did, it would be for the final ever time. With a surge of adrenaline, her eyes flick open, she jumps up, wriggles free, and decides, she is not going to die today. She dug the opening of her amputated arms into the mud, in a bid to stem the blood loss and prevent her muscles from falling out. She painstakingly made her way out of the culvert, and up the side of the canyon, back onto the road. To her great relief, there was no sign of Lawrence. As naked as the day she was born, drenched in blood, and covered in mud, her arms raised above her head, in her own words, so the blood and muscles didn't fall out of her arms, the brave girl proceeded to run down the road trying to find help. Within just a few minutes she would encounter her first car. Unfortunately, as I'm sure most of you could imagine, a naked girl covered in filth and drenched in blood, with her arms missing comes running at you screaming. It would be a very intimidating sight. So, the driver of the first car would briefly stare at her in disbelief before putting his foot down on the pedal, speeding off and leaving Mary stranded. Mary would have to run for several more miles before finding the next car. Luckily this time, although initially in shock, the occupants were more receptive, and helped Mary into the back of their car and swiftly drove her to the closest hospital. Mary would go on to be admitted to hospital for around 30 days. They performed emergency life-changing surgery, providing her with a pair of custom-made prosthetic arms. While recovering in the hospital, she would be interviewed several times by the police, and using the information she gave them, they were able to draw a detailed sketch of her attacker. Between the vivid description Mary was able to provide, and a stroke of luck, Lawrence's neighbor would go on to recognize the sketch, identifying Lawrence as the suspect, passing the information on to the police. Lawrence would eventually be sentenced to 14 years in prison. At the time he committed the crime, this was the maximum sentence the judge was permitted to hand out by law. However, the judge said the following while handing out his sentence: "If I had the power, I would send him to prison for the rest of his natural life." On a side note, Mary would also go on to win a civil lawsuit against Lawrence, to the sum of $2.56 million. This didn't account for much, as he didn't have anything to his name. Mary and her family were happy that he had been caught and sentenced, though disappointed that he was given such a small sentence for such a hideous crime. As far as they were concerned, 100 years would be too good for this vile man. Lawrence was rotten to the core and would demonstrate his true colors right after his sentencing. He didn't have 1 ounce of remorse. On her way out of the courtroom, Mary would have to walk by Lawrence to exit the courtroom. As she done so, Lawrence would say to her, "I will finish off the job, if it takes the rest of my life." This sent shivers up Mary's spine. She continued walking and exited the courtroom. The public would go on to share the sentiments of Mary's family, and after some outcry, a new bill would be passed. This bill was called the Singleton Bill. The Singleton Bill ceases the early release of criminals who used torture in their crime. It also allowed for judges to hand out a 25 to life sentence for crimes that fit the bill. You'd think the story would end here, but I guess once a monster, always a monster. After serving just over half his sentence, Lawrence would be released on parole after 8 years. When Mary found out, PTSD would kick in. She was terrified and always looking over her shoulders when she was outside. Not only that, but she was married now, with 2 kids, so she would worry for their safety, just in case he wanted to retaliate for her having him sent to prison. Only 2 years after being released from prison, Lawrence would strike again. Within the first 24 months of his release, he would go on to be arrested several times, for minor offenses, once for stealing a $10 disposable camera, another time for stealing a $3 hat, in which he would be sent to prison for 60 days. While in court, Lawrence would describe himself to the judge as a confused, muddle-headed old man. However, it was the crime he would commit on February 19, 1997, which would finally lock him away for good. This time he would attack a woman, who went by the name of Roxanne Hayes. This was a tragedy, as Roxanne, a mother of 3, would go on to die from stab wounds inflicted by Lawrence. He attacked her in his new home in Florida, an area he was moved to, as the people of California refused to accept him back into the community after his hideous crime he committed against Mary. Mary would go on to testify at Lawrence's court hearing. For the murder of Roxanne, she would testify about her terrifying ordeal, and the permanent toll it had taken on her. It was her testimony that ultimately led to Lawrence's death sentence. On April 14, 1998, Lawrence was sentenced to death for the murder of Roxanne. The judge would go on to say the following: "This was an unprovoked, senseless killing of a human being. We are living in times worse than Sodom and Gomorrah." Unfortunately, once again, Lawrence would avoid serving a lengthy prison sentence, as he would die from cancer on December 28, 2001, aged 74, only 3 years into his prison sentence. Mary would go on to admit in a later interview that she felt cheated, although her family felt relieved that this disgusting man would no longer be able to cause harm to anyone else. As an adult, Mary is a mother, an artist, and an advocate for women. She works with chalk pastels to create powerfully upbeat women, like female action figures. She also draws family and individual portraits on commission. And there we have it, the devastating case of Mary Vincent. Rest in peace to Roxanne Hayes. I hope her family and loved ones have somehow found peace after suffering from such a tragic loss. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up below, as this really helps us to create more content like this and reach a broader audience. Thanks for watching another video by TrueCrimeMMC. Until next time.